welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers, and rock stars of life. My guest today has been many things. He's an academic, an investigative journalist, and a documentarian. He spent years as a foreign correspondent for the BBC working in Russia, Washington, and Poland. He's an author of both fiction and non-fiction, a radio and television presenter. He was an advisor to the Labour government, and that's still not all. He has uncovered scandals, and he has been made a scapegoat of a scandal. Of the 8 or so books he has written to date, probably his most well-known is The Lost Child of Philomena Lee, which was turned into a multi-Oscar and BAFTA-nominated film, Philomena, starring Judi Dench and Steve Coogan. It is thanks to New College that I have the chance and huge privilege to be talking today to Martin Sixsmith. Hello, Martin.
Good morning, Katie.
There's so much to talk about. We needed a podcast series to cover all the many and varied aspects of your life, but I'd like to focus on 4 chapters, if I may. Education, Russia, politics, and your writing. So, education. You were at Manchester Grammar School, then New College, then Harvard, the Sorbonne, St. Petersburg, Birkbeck College, University of London, London Metropolitan University. You were clearly following Oscar Wilde's edict that you can never be overdressed or overeducated. Was that always your master plan?
No, I never had a master plan. Like most of us, I sort of drifted from one thing to another. So the real education was grammar school and Oxford, where I did modern languages. At New College, I did Russian and French. That was a fantastic time. And the St. Petersburg interlude was because in a 3-year language degree, they sent you away for a year in the middle of it, which was fantastic. And I went to St. Petersburg, which was then Leningrad. And that was a marvelously eye-opening experience because it was the Soviet Union. It meant that Russia was a very, very different place from what it is now, but also from what we knew in the West. It was a slightly sort of menacing place. You knew that it was an authoritarian state and that you probably were being trailed by people who were going to report on you. But at the same time, the people were so marvelously friendly and welcoming and hospitable that I felt completely at home there because people were so nice to me. And that sort of image of Russia, of a fantastically lovely people led by a variously unpleasant regime, has stayed with me.
I think you were at school. It was at 1969 when you first went.
Yeah, because at Manchester Grammar School, we had a really fantastic Russian teacher, a fellow called Ian Leviton, who wasn't much older than we were. He'd literally just come down from Cambridge. And so he's the person, the pedagogue who had the greatest impact on my life. And he was just full of enthusiasm. He loved Russia and made us love Russia as well. Love Russian culture, that sort of treasure house of literature, music and art that Russia has gifted to the world. And he was the one who said, well, why don't we spend a summer traveling to Moscow and to Leningrad? So he took us on a train across Europe and we went through
it's amazing.
Berlin. We got to the border of the Soviet Union, which was with Belarusia as it was then, and the train we were on had to be lifted up because the width of the tracks was wider in the Soviet Union than it was in the West, and the bogies were shifted out and new bogies were put under it. So it was a great experience, and we pitched up on the National Hotel opposite the Kremlin, and one of my friends was in a room that had a little plaque on it, and with our Russian we were able to figure out that it said that Nadezhda Krupskaya and Vladimir Lenin lived in this room, and we all got phone calls in the middle of the night from sultry-voiced ladies who were proposing something more interesting than a Russian lesson. And the next morning when we told our teacher what had happened, he said, under no circumstances must you accept this offer. And my friend Linklater put his hand up and he said, but sir, what if we just want to practice our Russian? So it was, how could you not love a place like that?
No, I went to the Trans-Siberian train with my father and I fielded those phone calls for my father at one of those Seven Sisters hotels. Bit disappointing for him that I was there, really. What was one of your most noteworthy memories of New College?
It was an introduction to a different world for me because I'm from near Liverpool, went to school in Manchester, and we weren't from a privileged family. My father was a local government official, my mother was a teacher, and it was, so on my staircase we had the Honourable Remnant, we had Lord this and Lord that, and I was just thinking, well, this must be what Oscar Wilde was writing about. It was the age of social mobility, wasn't it, when grammar schools allowed people to move up through the social strata. So that was a great eye-opener, and it was a marvellous 3 years, and I made friends there who I'm still friends with now all these years later. And the people who taught us were marvellous. The tuition was great, and we ended up speaking good Russian, not really because Oxford taught us Russian. They were more interesting teachers about sort of medieval literature, but we picked up Russian when we were in St. Petersburg, and that's been a great gift to have for the rest of my life. Manchester Grammar School is a bit of an academic hothouse, that it had a very long tradition of sending boys, it was a boys' school, to Oxbridge, and the people who ran the school had personal contacts with a lot of colleges. So I knew, for instance, that New College was the college for me because that was where Professor Fennell, who the Professor of Russian, was based, and that was why I ended up at New College.
With all the other academic institutions that you went to, which place would you say was the most life-changing for you?
Harvard, really. I graduated from Oxford and I'd applied for a couple of fellowships to go to the US, and the best one, the most lucrative one, was a thing called the Harkness Fellowship, which allowed, I think, 18 people each year to go to the US, paid your tuition fees, it paid your accommodation, it gave you a stipend to live on, and it was a 2-year fellowship, and they specified, this was a real hardship, that in the summer between the 2 years, you had to travel across the United States, and they gave you money to do that as well. So
wow.
It was absolutely marvellous.
Really hard to get, I would imagine. They're very prestigious.
I think so, yes. You had to submit something and do interviews and things, but I think that was probably life-changing because having had this privileged access to Russia, I then got the same thing for 2 years in America, and very helpful later on as a journalist to have that background in both the superpowers as they were then.
Yes. Did you go from Harvard to the BBC?
Came back from Harvard and did a year's graduate study at Oxford at St Antony's College. Then we had our first child by then, and at St Antony's I was on what was laughingly called a major state studentship, which paid, I think, £2,600 a year, and you just couldn't live on that if you had a young child. So I applied for a few jobs and was accepted by the BBC's trainee scheme, which was a fantastic point of access to the BBC. It was called the News Trainee Scheme. They took 6 people each year, and for the next 18 months they gave you a fantastic grounding in the art of journalism and the techniques of television and radio as well. And at the end of it, they didn't guarantee that you would have a job, but they said, if you work hard and you do well, then you can apply for jobs within the BBC, and most of our trainees do get jobs. So thank goodness I did.
To Moscow, was that your first placement?
No, in 1982, we were sitting in the trainees' common room, and a man called Harold Young, who ran the scheme, God bless him, came in and said, does anybody here speak French? And so I put my hand up and he said, well, we've got a junior reporter's job in Brussels going. How about it? So I said, well, yeah, okay. So I went and had 4 years there. And there was already a correspondent there, a man called Paul Reynolds, who may have been a bit worried about this young journalist arriving on his doorstep, but he wasn't. He was absolutely fantastic. And he really taught me how journalism works, because I'd had the 1.5 year sort of theoretical training by the BBC, but actually doing the job. So it was Paul Reynolds who was really marvellous to have kept in touch with him, and we live up the road from each other now all these years later. So I'm very, very grateful to him.
From there, what was your journalistic career path?
So promotion, a junior reporter in Brussels. BBC wanted to set up a new office in Geneva, so I did that. I did a year in Geneva. And then it was the time of solidarity and the revolt against the Soviet yoke, Lech Wałęsa and people. And they said, oh, you speak Russian, don't you? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, Polish is quite like Russian, isn't it? And I said, well, kind of. So they allowed me to have a quick conversion course to learn Polish, and then sent me to Poland. And I did 2 years there. And again, that was a great time. I mean, the basic law of the journalist is be in the right place at the right time. Being in Poland in the late 1980s, when the strikes in Gdańsk were happening and things were changing because of Gorbachev in Moscow, and the independence movements in the former Soviet satellite states were gaining traction. So it was a great 2 years, and I met Wałęsa and Coogan and Michnik and
oh my goodness,
all these guys. So when I first arrived, we were looking for a lingua franca, and I said, well, I speak Russian, and of course they all spoke Russian. And for them it was a joke. They were trying to overthrow the Russian yoke in Poland, but here they were speaking to the BBC correspondent in Russian. So I spent the 2 years learning Polish, and I can speak Polish now as well.
When you go to somewhere like Poland, are you set up with a team, or do you have to find your own team?
In relatively small postings like that, I arrived and there was a locally hired Polish fixer who was very good. So it was basically, that was it. But it was an easy posting because all the people we wanted to speak to were desperate to speak to Western news organisations. It was the Solidarity people who'd been trampled on for years, and some of them had just come out of jail. They'd been locked up after Jaruzelski came to power. And so they were knocking on our door. They really wanted us to talk to them. And so the job was easy in that sense. And it was also an easy story to report because we knew who the good guys were, we knew who the bad guys were.
Did you enjoy the job?
Yeah, I loved it. I loved Poland. Such a marvellous place to be, and a feeling of living in a heroic country. Poland had a dreadful history, had been partitioned left, right and centre by the Russians and the Germans and the Nazis and the Bolsheviks in the Second World War. Here we were a few decades later, and they were still under the heel of the Kremlin, and you just felt that heroism among them, that they wanted to stand up for freedom and independence. And I was there when Pope John Paul came for the visit to his homeland. And we went up to Gdansk, and he had an open-air mass on an airfield, and 1 million people turned out. 1 million people. It gave a great impetus to the independence movement, and I loved those 2 years there. And then I went to Moscow after that. So.
You were there for 4 years. 5
years in total. The first time was the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of free Russia, or independent Russia. So it was the Perestroika era of Gorbachev and then Yeltsin as well.
Yeah. After that, you're then BBC's Washington correspondent during the election and first presidential term of Bill Clinton. Let's go back to Russia. I actually listened to a podcast that you gave, I think it was the History Extra podcast, and you talked about how lovely the Russian people are. All we hear about are the terrible leaders, Lenin, Stalin, Putin. The poor Russians get this really sort of bad reputation. What was it about the people and the place that you loved?
Yeah, I mean, we all sort of speak about Russians doing this and doing that, but it's not the Russian people. The problem is that it's been a centralised autocracy for so long, and when the state controls all the sources of information, it's very easy to fool the people. And we read about these opinion polls that 90% of Russians support Putin. Not reliable. If somebody comes up to you in a street in Moscow looking very official and says, do you like our president? You're not going to say yes. You're not going to say no. But a lot of people do genuinely support Putin and support the war for historical reasons, but also because the propaganda. It's very hard to resist when every day you're being told that we are fighting for our survival against an aggressive West who is intent on destroying the Russian state. And only at very rare periods have the Russian people been able to sort of access proper information and understand that we maybe should not believe everything we're being told by the state. And one of those was in 1991, because one of the big planks in Gorbachev's Perestroika platform was glasnost, that he wanted people to have greater access to information. He genuinely did want to reform the way the country was run. He didn't want to destroy communism. He wanted communism with a human face. But in 1991, when the hardliners, the old dinosaurs, locked him up and said, oh no, we're going to go back to the old times of Brezhnev or perhaps even Stalin, the reason that coup failed is because the Russian people had understood that they didn't just have to go along with whatever the Kremlin was telling them. So these dreadful people, Yanayev and people who'd seized power and locked Gorbachev up, were telling the Russian people, we're in charge now, you have to do what we tell you. But that spirit of independence has been absorbed by the Russian people. So instead of going along with it, they turned out and they congregated around the Russian White House, which was the Russian parliament where Yeltsin had his power base. And I remember spending 3 days with them there, waiting for the tanks to come and crush them and enforce the rule of this terrible junta which had come to power. Everybody was just saying, well, what should we do? What should we do when the tanks come? And everybody was saying, well, we'll just link arms, and if they were going to crush us, they're going to crush us. Yeah, I don't know what would have happened. But in the end, the coup plotters got the message that the Russian people weren't going to go along with what they were being told this time in August 1991. And the tanks went back to base. And it felt like within 3 months, communism had gone, the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was free. And it felt like a great turning point. I listened to my reports from back then, and it was terrible optimism about, oh, everything's fine now. Communism's gone. Russia's going to be welcomed back into the community of nations. They're going to be a country like us. A few years after 1991, it did feel a little bit like that. But of course, it sort of dissipated and we're back to square one.
When you spoke to the people, you obviously had other information and you could see that they were being told a story that wasn't necessarily the right story. I guess if one person giving a different opinion, There's too much of the other to believe that.
Yeah. And nowadays, Putin certainly plays on that. He has closed down all independent media outlets. He's driven them out of Russia. The slight difference is now the internet and social media. So
can he control that? I mean, I know in China that's heavily controlled.
Russia's tried really hard, but it hasn't completely succeeded. So in Russia, the people say there are two generations now. There's the television generation and the internet generation. So the television generation are the older generation who do get absolutely all their news and all their information from state-controlled outlets, television, newspapers. And then hope for the future is that this younger generation, the internet generation, are able to access certain free sources of information. And I suppose that's the hope for the future, but I fear it's not going to happen today or tomorrow.
No. And I watched the Navalny documentary last night, and just seeing there how they manipulated the poisoning of Navalny is extraordinary. In your interview for the History Extra podcast, you said that Russia is not an irredeemable country. We have to engage with it. Obviously, we're at the beginning now of 2024, which is 2 years into the war with Ukraine, and with Alexei Navalny just being, murdered in prison a couple of weeks ago. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think clearly the vast amount of the blame for what's happening in Ukraine and what's happened to international relations lies at the door of the men in the Kremlin, and Vladimir Putin in particular. But the West isn't completely free of mistakes. We had that window of opportunity in the 1990s when Russia did want to engage with the West, did want to be part of the international community. And even in the first years of Putin's reign as president from 2000, I would say, till around 2003, he was making the same overtures to the West. He was saying, look, Russia is a European country. We want to be part of Europe. We want not only the prosperity that you've got, but also the democratic freedoms that you've got. He wanted a cooperation agreement with the European Union. When George Robertson, the head of NATO, went to Moscow, Putin said to him, well, when are you going to invite us to join NATO? And this is Putin. So something's happened to change that man who declared himself to be a Democrat and a lover of freedom and democracy, to change him from that to the swivelized megalomaniac who's now running Russia. And his version is, Putin's version, is that the West rebuffed his overtures of friendship and responded to his offers of cooperation with aggression, that NATO had promised it wouldn't advance into the former Soviet satellite states, and it broke all those promises. If I'm trying to be completely objective, there's an element of truth in that. Yeah. And NATO will not countenance any blame being attached to the West. So look, I'm not an apologist for Putin. I've written very critically of him and I've been attacked by his trolls and his bots. However, I think the West has also made some mistakes.
Where we are now, if you were given a blank sheet of paper, what would you do?
Well, as my Irish friends say when they're asked for directions, I wouldn't be starting from here. The situation is very, very difficult now. There is always hope, and all wars are solved by negotiation, and all international crises are solved by negotiation. So there's going to have to be negotiation. People are going to have to sit down at some stage. I thought it was quite instructive that when, in February 2 years ago, when it was obvious that Russian troops were massing on the borders of Ukraine and that an invasion was in the offing, there was a sudden flurry of diplomatic activity. And the West suddenly tried to address some of the complaints that Putin had been making for the last 10 years. So NATO said, well, perhaps we will look at the level of NATO forces in the former Soviet Warsaw Pact countries. We're not going to say Ukraine can never join NATO, but perhaps we can look at conditions on whether Ukraine joins NATO. And there was even a suggestion that we would accept that Ukraine would never join NATO. So we were prepared to negotiate when the gun was pointed at our heads. Hindsight is a great thing. If we had started those negotiations a bit earlier, might we have avoided the dreadful catastrophe that's going on in Ukraine? Maybe. Who knows? The problem is that you can't trust Putin as far as you can throw him because he will sign agreements and then renege on them. But at least if we'd engaged with that process of negotiation instead of just stonewalling, getting stonewall from the Kremlin in response, we might not be in the dreadful position we are now.
I'm hopping about a bit, but your most recent book is called The War of Nerves. We're going back now to the Cold War, which started in 1947 and lasted nearly 45 years. History and psychology are two of your main subjects of study. Why did you describe the Cold War as a war of nerves?
Because it was a war not just for control of territory and resources, it was a war for control of people's minds, of how people think. It was a confrontation of two different social and political systems, and both sides were desperate to convince their own people and people in the rest of the world that we are right and they are wrong. It was a war that shaped people's thinking, and I think a lot of that has remained with us, that fear of Armageddon.
I remember growing up thinking that this bomb was going to come and annihilate us all, and you had that low-level awareness of that.
Absolutely. And for maybe not our parents' generation, but a generation before, there was that dreadful thing of the duck and cover drills in America where children would be taught to do what they had to do if the bomb came, and they were told they had to dive under their school desks. That thought that you were going to have to protect yourself by diving under a flimsy desk left a lot of psychological baggage in people for many years. So there was that, and then also the psychological impact of being told that capitalism is right, communism is wrong, and vice versa. And then the use of dirty tricks as well. Both sides used psychological ploys. They used fake propaganda. They used fake news. It was going on well before Donald Trump. So all those psychological aspects of the Cold War really struck me as worth writing about. And that's why it's called the Cold War, the War of Nerves.
I remember reading about the fact that Russia said that AIDS was something that the West had made up. What were we making up about them?
We use psychological ploys as well, the same way that, yes, the AIDS thing was, the KGB called it Operacja Infektion, so Operation Infection, and they planted stories in newspapers in India originally, and then they spread around the world, that AIDS had been developed in a laboratory in the US by the CIA, and that they were using it mainly against black people. It was targeted against black people. So you can see that that would have a willing reception in certain countries and political circles around the world. And we certainly did the same thing. When Boris Pasternak was awarded the Nobel Prize, the CIA arranged to print Dr. Zhivago in Russian in a tiny, tiny edition, which would fit in somebody's back pocket. I've got a copy of this so that people going to Russia, the Soviet Union, could take these with them and distribute them as a propaganda ploy so that Russians would read this and become disaffected with the Soviet system. And they financed my old college at Oxford St Antony's, and we didn't know it, but it emerged that it had been funded and looked after by the CIA.
Oh, really?
St Antony's always had lots of funds available, and it only later emerged that these funds were from the CIA because they thought that people from St Antony's would spread the message of anti-communism, because it was a Russia-oriented college. I myself didn't do any of that. Encounter, the magazine, which was run by bien-pensant intellectuals, was also turned out to be funded by the CIA, and the people who had run it, Stephen Spender and Harold Lasky and people, were horrified to find out that their funds had been coming from the CIA. So we also had dirty tricks. Yeah.
And there was something that I was really interested in when you talk about confirmation bias and how we were never going to be able to see the other person's point of view particularly. And could you explain, because I think that's such a fascinating concept.
Confirmation bias is essentially only taking into account those pieces of information which confirm our already solidified and concretized views or our prejudices. And doing the research for the Cold War book, I just came up against so many instances of that, where politicians and diplomats would be sitting in committees and sifting the evidence of what was going on in the Soviet Union, because it was a very opaque thing. Criminology was basically reading the runes. For the West, trying to figure out what was going on in the Soviet Union was very hard because there were no sort of open sources of information and all decisions were taken behind closed doors. So politicians in London and Washington developed their own view of what was going on. And even when information was presented to them that contradicted the views they'd already developed, they, without fail, carried on believing what they wanted to believe. And we're doing it now, even with Putin. The West has failed to try to understand what Putin is thinking and saying, what his intentions are. The Duke of Wellington very famously said that the whole art of war consists of guessing what's going on the other side of the hill. Because if you don't understand your enemy, you're never going to defeat him. And we've refused to try to understand what's going on in Russia. So it's to do with listening to what Putin's saying and instead of just blanking everything that's coming from him, to try and understand it for our own advantage, not to be soft on him, but to figure out how we should act in the best way for ourselves.
This episode of Bandwidth Conversations is in support of the IRIS Project. I recently interviewed environmentalist Ben Goldsmith on this podcast, and he set up this charity in memory of his daughter Iris, who died in a tragic accident aged 15. Iris had a deep connection with and love of the natural world. The IRIS Project is building a global community of young people working to protect and restore their local natural environments. Young people are already leading the way in finding solutions to the climate and ecological crises we are facing, and the IRIS Project funds, connects, supports and mentors them. I was blown away by these extraordinary young people and what they are managing to achieve. For more information on the incredible work they do, or to donate, please check out their website, theirisproject.org. That's theirisproject.org. Thank you. Yeah. Well, let's switch to British politics. What enticed you to change your course?
Well, 1997, really, when Tony Blair was elected on the 1st of May. That's when I left the BBC. I'd gone back to Russia again for another term in Moscow. But when Blair was elected, it just seemed like a breath of fresh air in British politics. And for a journalist who'd spent nearly 20 years being a journalist on the outside of power looking in, the prospect of being on the inside of that tent, working with a government which understood and valued the importance of communications, relations with the media, it was an opportunity which was too good to refuse. So poacher turned gamekeeper. And I went to work for the Government Information and Communications Service, which was a civil service job. It wasn't a Labour Party job, but it made it easier for me in the sense that I felt a lot of sympathy for what Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were doing in 1997. And so I spent 5 years doing that. I worked as a communications director and also as press attaché to a series of really very impressive ministers in the government. First of all, Harriet Harman and Frank Field, both of whom were marvellous. Even though they didn't see eye to eye, they didn't get on. But that was a great time to work with them. And then most of all, the man I admired most of all, with Alistair Darling, who was a man of great integrity. He was in politics not for himself. He was in politics for the good of the country. And he's never got the credit he deserved. I mean, he was the man who really saved us. Not at all, actually. No, he saved us from a dreadful fate during the great crash when everybody was saying, oh, no, it'll be all right. And Alistair said, actually, it's not all right. And we need to take action now. And he did do. And he didn't get the credit for that. Very sadly, he died a few months ago. He also gave me some good advice because in 2001, I was going to go and work for Stephen Byers, who was the transport minister. And Alistair Darling said to me, I don't think he would begrudge me saying this now. He said, look, Martin, the only person Stephen Byers is interested in is Stephen Byers, or the only thing. He was telling me, don't go and work for Stephen Byers. But I was young and foolish then, and I thought I knew better. So I did go and work for him. And all the ministers I've mentioned so far have been people of great integrity, and Stephen Byers just wasn't.
I think on the cusp of another Labour government, but you said, and I can't remember where I read it now, but of your time in government, that there was sadness at seeing how that high idealism I shared was thrown away.
The Iraq War, I think that was a big turning point. 1997 was a moment of great hope for renewal. And Tony appeared on the balcony of the festival hall and he said, a new dawn has broken, has it not? Bit of a soundbite, but
but what? We all felt that.
We felt that, we did. All political careers end in failure, it's an axiom, and things went wrong. But for the first few years, there was great hope. The difference between 97 and now, I think, is that the Labour government, Tony Blair's government, inherited a kind of rosy economic situation. Things were going well. It was a very propitious time to come into government. And 2024, sadly, for Keir Starmer, is not a propitious time to come into government. And he's going to inherit a lot of problems, and it's going to take a lot of very hard work to turn that round.
For those who don't remember, how did your dismissal come about?
I'd had 5 years, from 97 to the beginning of 2002, where things broadly went okay. The reason I went to Stephen Byers' department is that the previous September, 2001, the attack on the Twin Towers, Manhattan happened, and Stephen Byers' political advisor, a woman called Jo Moore, had sent an email saying this is a good time to put out some bad news, which was some sort of petty little thing about some controversy over Labour MPs' expenses claims. And that email had been leaked. It created such a furore that a Labour apparatchik could be thinking about the fortunes of Labour MPs who'd fiddled their expenses at a time when people were being killed in their hundreds in New York. There were calls for Jo Moore to resign, calls for Stephen Byers to resign, but Downing Street decided that no, we can withstand the pressure, and Jo Moore made an apology on camera, but the condition was that it must never happen again. So the head of communications in the department left, and I went there. The brief was to make sure that it didn't happen again. But the following February, when Princess Margaret died, there was another suggestion that this, again, would be a good time to bury bad news. And again, this was some petty thing about rail statistics. And I sent an email, a slightly facetious email, saying, Princess Margaret is being buried today. Let's make sure that's the only thing that's buried. In other words, no more burying of bad news. And that leaked to the press. And again, there was great furore, and it was inevitable that Jo Moore would have to go this time. But Stephen Byers said, well, let's distribute blame even-handedly, not just on the political side, Jo Moore, but I think the civil servant, Martin, should also resign as well. He foolishly announced that Martin and Jo have both resigned. I couldn't remember resigning.
I think it's something you'd remember.
I'd been for an eye test, actually, and they drops in my eyes. I remember coming out with all that blurry vision and thinking, I'm sure I didn't resign. So there was then a lot of pressure on me from the government to say, well, could you just go quietly, please, just accept that you did resign. And being a bit of a bolshy northerner, I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. Eventually, they said, okay, well, let's negotiate a deal. Perhaps we could accept that perhaps you've resigned from that post, but we'll give you another post in the civil service elsewhere. But the negotiations weren't in good faith. In the end, there were so many journalists wanting to find out about the story that I did some stories with the Sunday Times, and they wrote it at the approximate length of War and Peace. All relations were then skewed with the government, and there was no way back then. Yeah. So the government appointed a QC, great expense, I'm sure, to negotiate a settlement between them. So they knew they were in the wrong. And eventually they paid me a lot of money. And Stephen Byers had to make an apology to Parliament and then make another apology because he'd fibbed again in the second apology. And eventually he had to go. So he left in disgrace. Jo Moore left. And I also left, but with a lot of money in my back pocket and an apology from the government. It was an unhappy thing.
Well, it must be unbelievably traumatic because it's your life.
They just thought of it. Things could have worked out all right. One door closes, another door opens. So in 2002, I was out of the government. Having had a proper day job for the last 20 years with being paid at the end of the month, I didn't have that anymore. So it was then a question of looking around and seeing, what shall I do next?
Well, after that, you go on to advise The Thick of It and In the Loop, and it looks like you're pretty much writing a book a year. You're making documentaries, you're presenting on Radio 4. I read 2 of your books and I'm particularly keen to talk about them. One is Philomena and the second is Aisha's Gift. Well, and I've also watched the film, Philomena film, and it looks from that sort of chapter of your life opened on the heels of your unfair dismissal, and you were courted to tell Philomena's story. And for those who don't know, Philomena was an unmarried mother in Ireland. In the 1950s, she was forced to give up her son, Anthony, by the nuns of Sean Ross Abbey, an Irish convent. And they sold Anthony to a family in America. And decades later, Philomena's daughter approached you to see if you could help find him. So what persuaded you to take up the case? Because this was not an avenue that you were thinking of pursuing. No,
it definitely wasn't. It was not like anything I'd done before. I'd done politics and wars and that sort of thing. But it was Philomena really herself who persuaded me. Her daughter had asked a friend to talk to me at a New Year's party. I spoke to Philomena's daughter, and then I met Philomena, and she was just so lovely. I mean, she was so fantastic. Judi Dench plays so fantastically in the film.
Oh, does she? Is that very true to how she is?
Yeah, it is. Philomena came to some of the shooting, and Judi Dench was in costume, and you could just see the two of them were getting on really well together. So Philomena, she could have been terribly bitter after everything that happened to her with the way she was treated by the nuns and the way that her child was taken away from her. She didn't want to give her child up, and Anthony was taken for adoption against Philomena's wishes. So that would be enough to make anybody bitter. And she'd had 3 years in the convent with her son, so there was the time for proper maternal bonding with child. It wasn't as if a sort of newborn baby was taken away from her. But she wasn't bitter. She was just so marvellous. I mean, she was just sort of a fantastic, lovely person. And so that was why I thought, yeah, I would like to do this story.
I've just watched Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. In your experience and with your psychology hat on, what makes people in power, I'm thinking about the Post Office, I'm thinking about the nuns, do the wrong thing?
Yeah, many of the nuns were lovely women in the story and in real life. One of the nuns in the convent, Sister Annunziata, was very close to Philomena. So she was the person who provided the photographs of Philomena with her baby, Anthony. And Philomena said, if she hadn't given me these photographs, I would have no record of Anthony. So it's the hierarchy again. What makes them so dreadful? It's because in Ireland it was a very sort of special situation because the sort of symbiosis of church and state was so tight. They ran the country with a rod of iron. The church's position was, we were just helping out with a social problem, that when people had babies out of marriage, we took them in and looked after them. But it was the church that had created the social problem by stigmatizing sex outside marriage and single mothers. You can read the records of it. It was absolutely dreadful. The prejudice against these young girls, many of whom Philomena didn't know how babies were made. She was 17, and girls who'd been the victims of rape or incest, or they'd been seduced by priests.
And then they were punished again.
So absolutely dreadful. And the state was completely complicit in this because the church held the state to ransom, because the secular government of Ireland knew that if the priests preached from the pulpit that you should vote De Valera or you should vote against him, then people would do that. So the state was enthralled to the church. And it was a nice little earner as well, because these girls who were in these mother and baby homes had to work, and the church kept the proceeds. And you could only leave if you paid them £100. In those days, it was a massive amount. And most people couldn't afford it. Philomena couldn't afford it. So she did her 3 years working in the laundries. Dreadful all around. But Philomena, to her great credit, maintained her humanity and her resilience and her optimism through all of that.
Yeah. And so do you think that the nuns in charge and who came up with this scheme, I guess they just believed what they were doing was the right thing?
They did. They believed they were taking the babies away from the single mothers was protecting the babies, because they didn't want the babies to inherit the sins of the mothers. The women who had children outside of wedlock were deemed to be sinners. Philomena was told, you need to repent or you'll go to hell, and we're taking your baby away from you to protect your baby from the sin that you have visited on the world. Then when they took the baby away from her, they told her, if you ever talk about what has happened here...
Oh, I know, that's even worse, because then she has to hold it in for decades.
She did, yeah. If you ever reveal this guilty secret, then you'll go to hell. So she didn't tell anybody for years and years and years. And by the time she told her daughter, her lost son would be in his 40s, so it was many years later. And only then did she say, well, look, I've got to tell you what happened. You have a brother. We don't know where he is, but you have a brother.
It was so interesting to read the book, which is a very different way of telling than the film, because the film sort of follows you and Philomena, whereas the book is all about Anthony, who becomes Michael. And it's a heartbreaking and enraging story because he felt abandoned, and his adoptive family, I guess with the best will in the world, thought that it was better to stamp down on his memories of his mother and just say, no, she didn't want you. And then years later, he went back to the abbey and the nun said, she's not looking for you, she didn't want you. He died of AIDS, but he was a highly respected member of the Republican Party, which was also tough given the fact that they have such grim views of gay men. But when you and Philomena go in search of him, could you tell us the unbelievable and serendipitous events that led you to find him? Because it was a 1 in a million chance that you were going to do that.
Yes, there were a lot of improbable things that happened. The first thing, you mentioned that the nuns told Michael that your mother's not looking for you, but they knew she was looking for him because she had also come to the convent on several occasions saying, please, could you tell me where my son is? And Michael had gone to the convent on 3 occasions saying, please, could you tell me where my mother is? And the nuns knew both sides of the story. They knew that mother and son were both looking for each other, and yet they didn't put them in touch. And that's probably the cruelest thing. Michael was very ill with AIDS, and he went back to the convent and said, if you won't tell me where my mother is, at least please would you let me be buried in this convent in case she ever comes looking for me. And I'll put some information on my headstone which will tell her what happened to me, so at least she'll know what happened to me. And he did. He was buried in the convent, and the headstone was there, and it had the information about him. It was called A Man of Two Nations, and it explained a little bit about what had happened to him. And that was a clue for us. Looking for him, there were many other clues as well. I mean, one of the oddest coincidences was that he'd been a very senior figure in the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan, under George Bush Sr. And he and I had been in the same room at a Republican convention in Houston. I mean, what are the odds of that?
I know. It's incredible.
So Philomena never found her son alive, but she found out what had happened to him. And she does go to the grave now, and she says, at least you're back in Ireland. At least I can talk to you now. But the hardest thing for her was when Michael's partner came over to London, and we all sat in my front room in Knightsbridge, and he said to Philomena, he said, well, of course, when we came back to the nuns told Michael that you didn't want him and that you just handed him over as soon as he was born. And that was the end of the story. And Philomena was so upset by that because that was not what had happened. She nursed him for 3 years. She didn't want to give him away. And yet the nuns were telling lies about it.
That's so damaging for both of them. Well, the story was picked up and turned into a film with the fabulous Judi Dench and Steve Coogan, and it was nominated for no less than 4 Oscars. How did that happen?
Well, Steve Coogan, really. He comes from a Catholic family himself. His parents had fostered children. So he had that sort of background, an Irish Catholic family, Coogan being an Irish name. He picked up on the one aspect of the story, which was not so much what had happened to Anthony, who became Michael in America, but he saw a photograph of Philomena and me in The Guardian, and we were both having a laugh.
Oh, I think I've seen that photograph. It's so lovely.
And he saw it and he said, how these very disparate people, how did they develop such an obviously friendly relationship? The silly old Irish lady, she's not silly and she's not old, this Irish lady and this rather distant, middle-class, Oxbridge-educated Englishman. And so that piqued his interest, and that's why he wanted to make the story about the relationship. He made a sort of road movie, a buddy movie between Martin and Philomena. And the Martin character that he plays is partly me, but mainly a lot of Steve.
Well, that must be hard to see because you start off as being a bit prickly and bruised, and I wondered if that was just a film device.
Yeah, Steve said, I used to have to let you know that we'd be playing you as a bit of a prat.
Is that what he said?
But Martin, we refer to him as Martin, not as you, because he was a character, half Steve and half me. Martin starts out as a bit of a prat, bit up himself, but he redeems himself. And he said it's a bit like that movie with Richard Gere, Pretty Woman.
Oh, yes,
Julia
yes.
Roberts, where ostensibly he rescues her from this life of prostitution. And at the end, he said, well, what happens next? And she said, well, she rescues him right back. So with us, it was a sort of ostensibly Martin is helping Philomena out with her search for her lost son. But actually, at the same time, she's helping him out by explaining to him what's important in life. And you can't live your whole life on an intellectual, distant, unemotional basis. And emotions are important as well. And he rescues her and she rescued him right back. So that was the arc of the story.
So I interviewed recently Bonnie Garmus, who wrote the brilliant Lessons in Chemistry, and she said, I can't watch the TV series because I'll have heart failure because they've changed it so much. But did that feel like that to you?
Not really, no. Every iteration of a story changes it. So me writing the book changed. Some characters were merged into one. Some chronology was telescoped. Some events were smoothed out. And then moving it into a film is another level of doing that. But Steve and Jeff Pope, who wrote the screenplay, the two of them together, were very inclusive. And so I was involved in the development of the storyline right from the beginning. So I knew what was going to happen. No, I don't dislike watching the movie. I think it's a very good movie.
No, well, I watched it actually just recently again. It is a really beautiful movie. John McInerney was the boy who Michael's father, Anthony's father, and he actually wanted to see Philomena again. It wasn't a one-off for him, but her family wouldn't allow them to meet up. So it was just a series of tragic events that could have had a very different outcome. Did you ever find him?
We tried. What happened was that she'd been in a convent, so she didn't know the facts of life, and she was at a county fair in Limerick, and she met this boy, John McInerney, and they had a night together. She didn't know it, but she got pregnant that night, and she'd arranged to meet him the following weekend, but her aunt said, oh no, I'm not going to let you out to see this boy. So she didn't turn up at the place where they'd arranged to meet, and we assumed that John McInerney did turn up. And she never saw him again. So she had the baby, she was a single mother, and we assumed that John never knew that he was the father of this rather special boy who had a rather special life. So we tried to track him down. We knew he'd worked for the post office, that he was an official in the post office. So we went through the post office records, we went through all the John McInerneys in the Irish telephone book for the whole of Ireland. And then somebody said, we think he might have emigrated to Canada. So we went through all the
my
John
goodness.
McInerneys
So you really
Canada.
tried.
We couldn't find him.
Okay. Learning about Philomena's story, you uncovered that this was a really big enterprise at the time. You subsequently make a documentary about Ireland's lost children. What was the scale of this?
Tens of thousands of women. I've seen estimates up to 60,000 women from the period from the end of the Second World War right up until the 1970s, when being a single mother was stigmatized by the state and the church, and with the result that families decided that their daughters would have to go into convents to have their children to cover up the shame, that the family wouldn't be shamed. During those 30 years or so, the Irish church took away probably, certainly tens of thousands, maybe 60,000 children, and put them up for adoption, initially in Ireland. They didn't want them to go to the north of Ireland because they might be adopted by Protestants, which would be damnation for the children, certainly not in England because the same thing could happen to them. But America was a different prospect, and Americans came looking for babies in Ireland, and it wasn't babies for sale, it was babies for adoption, but it was understood that in return for receiving this baby from an Irish convent, you, the parents, would make a generous donation to the Catholic Church in Ireland, and it was codified. It was in $1,000, $2,000. It was a lot of money coming in from these children. And then the church spent the next 50 years trying to stop the adopted children being in touch with their parents and trying to stop the mothers who'd had their babies taken away from them contacting their children. And that's why I made the documentary. We went to America and filmed there with children who'd been adopted and heard the stories of how the church had been deliberately stopping them being in contact with their birth mothers, and vice versa, stopping the mothers being in contact with their children, which I found absolutely shocking.
Aisha's Gift. It's a story of a lady who comes to you after her father has allegedly committed suicide in Pakistan, and she suspects foul play. And what unfolds is a story of Pakistani mafia, honour killings, human trafficking, land grabbing, you name it. And I think it's being made into a Channel 4 series with David Morrissey playing you. And your investigations coincided with your own brother taking his life, which brought you and Aisha together as you're both searching for answers about the loss over the death of a loved one. So I read it. I actually couldn't put it down. I think I sort of sat down and just stayed with it. It was a roller coaster, twisty, turny, unbelievable ending, and all the more horrifying because it's true. So I had one question for you, which is, at one point you confront a dangerous criminal who you have named Javed Shafiq, when I'm saying his name properly, and you're effectively his prisoner. And you have also seen another prisoner of his who has been tortured and who was then shot in your presence. And yet you keep asking him these questions that you know are going to aggravate him. So I just thought, wow, Martin, do you have a lower fear quotient than everybody else? Or is that your psychology, knowing that I can push them that hard?
I think it's the journalist's sense of distance, being safe. And my cameraman always used to say to me, if we were in war zones or dangerous situations, looking through the camera, you felt you were watching a story unfold and you weren't part of it, so you weren't in danger. And I think journalists develop that sense of invincibility, that we're protected by this magic cloak of being a journalist, that we're outside the story and we can do all that. And it leads people into dangerous situations, not so much myself, but I've seen war correspondents who become very addicted to that adrenaline of being in dangerous situations. But also I felt that it was important to press on with the investigation to find answers for Aisha about what had happened to her father. The relationship was fraught in the sense that she wanted one answer to what had happened to her father. She wanted him to be a hero who had been murdered for being a good man and standing up for the things that were right. And I felt that that's not necessarily the case. I think he might turn out to be a bit of a bad guy who'd been involved in things that Aisha didn't really want to find out about. And that became a source of friction between the two of us. And at one stage, I decided I wasn't going to carry on anymore because she wanted me to write the thing in a way that she wanted it to be written. And I wanted to be a journalist about it. But as you say, the thing that then brought us back together was that my brother killed himself. And that rekindled that empathy between Aisha and me, because from then on, we were both looking for answers to what happened to somebody we loved, but also, more than that, who was this person whom we loved and who has now gone, whom we thought we knew, but maybe we didn't know. And Aisha opened up to thinking that maybe she didn't really know her father that well. Maybe she shouldn't try to prejudge how the story is going to end. And I felt the same about my brother, that I thought I knew him. Maybe I didn't really.
Well, at the very end of the book, you include a passage that he wrote of his time in a sanatorium, and he was such a beautiful and sensitive writer.
He was a beautiful and sensitive person, and I think that was his downfall. He found the world very hard to cope with.
And Martin, you've lost your mother to suicide as well.
She was very old, and she knew she was ill. She didn't want to be a burden to her two sons, to me and my brother, and she was a very strong-willed woman, and she decided, well, I'm going to go now. And she took advice on what she should swallow, and she swallowed it.
Is there any advice that you can share with people who go through similar situations?
Yeah, every death, every suicide is different. But the one thing I could say is talk to people before something happens. Don't let somebody go without having a proper conversation with them about things that are important. And not just siblings, but talk to parents before they go, because once somebody's gone, you can't talk to them anymore.
You have had this unbelievable life doing all these amazing things. There have obviously been huge highs. You've had a fair share of knocks. You've had people turn against you in government. You've talked to ruthless killers in Pakistan. You were 5 years behind the Iron Curtain, where there must have been a bit of treading on eggshells. Could you describe a moment when you thought you should have picked a safe desk job?
Many times. It's the path not taken, isn't it, really? I mean, we can all look at turning points in our life and say, this is the moment when I went that way, this is the moment when I perhaps could have gone that way. And I tried to write about that in Philomena, really, because for Anthony, there was a real turning point moment that he was in a convent for unmarried mothers. He was a 3-year-old, and the lady who'd come from St. Louis, Missouri to adopt a child was looking for a girl, not for a boy. And she found the girl who was in this nursery with Philomena's son. And she picked up the young girl Marge, who she was going to take to America. And Anthony came running over because he was so close to this young girl that Marge said, well, I'm going to take both of them. So it was that sort of little random nudge of fate that Anthony going in that direction rather than in that direction. I use the image of Brownian motion, where all these little particles are bouncing off each other and you don't know which way they're going to go. Yes. And, it happens in our life. So looking back, we can all pick a time where we went one way instead of the other way, but you can't go back and change it.
When you look back on all the different and varied things that you've done, is there anything in particular that you would pick out and say, well, I'm so proud of that?
I think a writer is always proud of his books because you put a lot of yourself into the books. Yevgeny Zamyatin, a Russian author, said, my books are my children. And when I send them out into the world, it's like sending a son out to school, and you've dressed him up nicely and I've given him all the advice I can. But once he's out there, he's on his own, and people might be nice to him and they might not. You feel that about your books?
Yes,
and films,
I can imagine that.
Those are the things that you create and feel. That put a lot of myself into that, along with my real children, the books, surrogate children as well. So, yeah. Proud of both of them, the real ones and the pretend ones.
And for young people today, embarking on their careers, what's the most important thing that you've learned?
Choose something you really want to do, because you're going to be doing it for a long time, and don't condemn yourself to doing a job that you really hate doing. Don't live a life that you don't want to live. Make sure you want to enjoy it.
Fantastic. Are you ever planning on retiring and tending your garden or something like that?
Yes, il faut cultiver son jardin, as Voltaire said. No, I don't think so. I mean, when you reach this stage in life, the real dread is that the old brain stops working, and it's nice to keep the brain fit as well as the body fit as well. And I like doing it, so why not?
Well, I'm looking forward to the television version of Aisha's Gift. Very much looking forward to that coming out. And of course, people are going to look at it and say, well, that wouldn't happen in real life. And it did. Mark Twain said, 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the things you did. So I don't think you're going to be that disappointed then. So that's pretty good. But thank you so much for coming today, Martin. I have been looking forward to this for such a long time, and it's been such a treat to talk to you, and you've been so generous with your time. So thank you.
Thank you, Katie. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to Matthew Passy and all at the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.